December 7th, 1942, minus 40 Celsius, somewhere near the frozen Donets basin. The air was crystalline, brittle, each inhalation cutting through German lungs with a sting that demanded respect. From a ridge overlooking the rail line, Oberleutnant Karl-Heinz Strasser squinted through the frost-frozen lenses of his binoculars, disbelief etched on his wind-bitten face. He had expected chaos, stalled supply trains, and retreating engineers. What he saw instead made him question every assumption about the Red Army he had ever held. A string of Soviet freight cars, coal, munitions, food, and fuel, snaked along the icebound rails like an immovable iron serpent, crawling through drifts higher than any man could stand. And they were moving at an almost impossible pace. Strasser's formation, the 7th Staffel of JG 51, had been tasked with interdiction. For weeks, German air reconnaissance reports had promised easy targets: frozen ground, broken rails, undersupplied, and inexperienced rail workers. Yet, as he tracked the movement, smoke from steam locomotives spiraling in ghostly columns against the white expanse, he realized the trains were not only operational, they were thriving. Each engine seemed to bite through the frost with uncanny determination, wheels gripping rails slick with snow and ice, wheels turning, pistons churning, whistles piercing the frozen stillness. He turned to his comrade, Feldwebel Otto Breuer. "They can't keep these running," he muttered. Breuer shook his head, lips blue, eyes wide. "They're not just running, Karl. They're on schedule." The Germans had assumed that Soviet supply lines would collapse under the winter, that starvation, frostbite, and mechanical failure would force the Red Army to rely solely on local requisitioning. Instead, what Strasser now observed was the result of an industrial and human feat that defied expectation. Locomotives, many of them decades old, hissed steam and groaned under tons of coal, yet ran without interruption. Each train carried the lifeblood of the Red Army: ammunition for the 62nd Tank Brigade, food for the 13th Infantry Division, fuel for the field hospitals that operated 24 hours to prevent frostbite deaths among civilians and soldiers alike. In the German mind, these trains should have been corpses, buried in snowdrifts, their engineers frozen at their posts. They were anything but. The secret, Strasser began to realize as he watched from the ridge, lay in the sheer determination of the Soviet rail workforce. Men and women wrapped in rags, boots half frozen, faces ruddy from exposure, scurried along the tracks, shovels in hand, hammers and wrenches dangling from belts. Broken rails were replaced as soon as frost cracked them. Ice on switches was chipped away by hand with picks that flew sparks against steel. Each siding, each turnout, each signal post was monitored, adjusted, and maintained by teams that worked through the night in near darkness, guided by lanterns and the glow of fires burning just off the ballast. It was not brute force alone, though there was plenty of that, but precision, coordination, and a disciplined rhythm that seemed almost impossible under the circumstances. Strasser's Luftwaffe experience told him something fundamental about logistical warfare. It was rarely the bullets or tanks that won battles. It was the supply lines that determined whether an army could live or die. And now, as he traced the path of the next train, a supply of 50,000 rounds of 76.2 millimeter artillery shells destined for the embattled Stalingrad front, he understood that the Soviet rail system was not merely functional. It was an operational weapon, moving faster and more efficiently than German intelligence had ever predicted. He cursed under his breath, tightening his scarf against the wind. The Oberkommando der Wehrmacht had underestimated not just the Russians' industrial capacity, but their sheer capacity for endurance. On the ground, the sight was even more impressive. In small stations, surrounded by drifted snow and frozen rivers, groups of railway workers maintained schedules down to the hour. Steam engines were stoked constantly, often with coal frozen into lumps larger than a man's fist. Firemen, hands raw and blistered, shoveled until blisters bled through gloves. Conductors bundled in patched coats and scarves, verified manifests in the near-blinding snow, noting weight distributions and ensuring that even the heaviest trains could traverse temporary trestles and makeshift rails erected where frost had heaved the originals. Each train departed like clockwork, sometimes with 10 minutes to spare. German reconnaissance reports had labeled these operations improbable. Strasser, a combat veteran of France, Poland, and Kursk, found himself forced to agree. He had known discipline. He had seen planning. But what he now observed was something different, an amalgam of industrial resilience, national will, and individual grit that could not be quantified in German doctrine. Even the locomotives themselves were marvels of endurance. Soviet engineers had modified older engines with improvisational technology to prevent freezing, lubricants infused with antifreeze, boilers wrapped in insulated cladding, and specially treated fireboxes that could burn low-grade coal efficiently. Wheels were fitted with ice cleats, tracks heated with minimal fires, rails wrapped in oil-soaked canvas where drift and frost threatened expansion. It was ingenuity born of necessity, yet executed at a scale that Strasser's mind refused to fully process. He watched one particular train, a massive 1,200-ton freight composed of flatbeds, tank transports, and munitions cars. The lead engine shuddered as it struck adrift, nearly tipping, but the crew, 3 men jammed in the cab, faces streaked with soot and frozen sweat, worked seamlessly. One man shifted coal, another adjusted the throttle, the third monitored steam pressure, calling out figures in a voice that carried across the wind. With a synchronized hiss and clatter, the train regained momentum. Strasser felt his stomach tighten. There was no visible path, no friendly line of retreat. Yet these trains advanced with relentless determination, a tide of steel defying winter itself. He reflected on the reports of German spies and partisans operating behind Soviet lines. Many had described frozen landscapes, immobilized vehicles, soldiers suffering from frostbite, and infrastructure destroyed by the winter. But here, in plain sight, the enemy proved that such assumptions were not only wrong, they were dangerously naive. The Soviets were not only surviving the winter, they were thriving in it, using it as an ally, turning the extreme conditions into a force multiplier. Each locomotive that reached the front lines unscathed meant artillery shells in the hands of Red Army gunners, food for soldiers, and medical supplies for wounded men who might otherwise die in frozen rivers or open fields. By nightfall, the ridge was bathed in moonlight, reflecting off the snow, each train a glinting line against the white landscape. Strasser counted 9 in succession, each pulling away from small stations where workers labored under the orange glow of firelight. The cold was a physical presence, gnawing through layers of uniform, yet the engineers moved as though it were nothing. Sparks flew from coal shovels, steam hissed, and distant whistles echoed across the plain. The sheer scale was overwhelming. German intelligence had expected a collapse under attrition, a breakdown from exhaustion and weather. What they encountered instead was a logistical miracle. For Strasser and his fellow pilots, the implications were immediate and terrifying. Interdicting these trains would require not just skill, but overwhelming firepower, and even then, success was uncertain. Every destroyed train could be replaced, rerouted, or delayed only briefly. The Red Army's capacity for improvisation was beyond the expectations of German doctrine, an unknown variable in a winter war already fraught with peril. By the time the Luftwaffe claimed 1 train destroyed, 2 more would have rolled past, and each train that reached Stalingrad, Voronezh, or the Donets basin kept Red Army positions supplied, soldiers fed, tanks fueled, artillery firing. Strasser's reconnaissance report would be concise, unbelievable. Operational lines fully functional despite conditions impossible by prior assessment. Enemy supply chains demonstrate resilience, discipline, and engineering skill beyond expectation. Immediate recalibration of interdiction tactics required. The Germans could not yet grasp the human element driving these steel behemoths. The workers themselves were ordinary men and women, often peasants drafted into railway brigades, surviving on rations far thinner than those at the front. Many had lost limbs or fingers to frostbite in previous years, yet returned to the rails because the winter demanded it. Their lives were inseparable from the trains they maintained. In the frigid darkness, with coal smoke curling into the black sky, these ordinary people were performing feats that even combat veterans struggled to comprehend. Each train that successfully arrived at its destination was a testament to endurance, ingenuity, and unbreakable will, the kind of quiet heroism that could not be bombed or strafed into oblivion. Strasser exhaled through frosted lips, binoculars lowering slowly. He had flown countless missions, survived engagements with the finest Soviet pilots, and yet nothing prepared him for this. Not tanks, not guns, not fortifications, but the simple, unyielding movement of trains across frozen rails. The realization settled in. The Eastern Front was as much about logistics as combat. If these trains ran, the Red Army survived. And if they survived, nothing, even the Luftwaffe, could stop them entirely. January 2nd, 1943. The wind tore across the Donets basin like a steel whip, carrying snow in sharp, slicing clouds that seemed to erase the horizon. From a vantage point atop a shattered telegraph pole, Oberleutnant Strasser scanned the line again. The trains, miraculously, kept moving. Not just a few, they stretched for miles. In the distance, the rhythmic clatter of wheels on steel rang out, muffled by drifts but unmistakable. Every conductor, every brakeman, every engineer he had glimpsed in December had been replaced by another equally tireless cohort. The Soviet rail system seemed infinite, a river of iron that flowed regardless of frost, wind, or bombardment. On the ground, the reality was even harsher than Strasser could have imagined from the ridge. Workers labored in temperatures that froze exposed skin in seconds. Tracks, warped by frost heave, were jacked and aligned by hand. Snowed-in switches were cleared with pickaxes and brushes. Steam engines shivered under the strain, pistons rattling, boilers glowing red from overwork. Coal bunkers were refilled with frozen chunks that had been broken apart with axes before shoveling. Frozen couplings snapped under stress, and still the trains pressed forward. Each freight car carried supplies measured in tons. Shells, rifles, rations, even replacement locomotives shipped in pieces to be assembled on site. Strasser had flown reconnaissance missions over the Eastern Front for months, but nothing prepared him for this. German doctrine assumed logistical collapse at these temperatures. The Wehrmacht's maps and intelligence reports painted a frozen wasteland where trains stalled for days or even weeks, where frostbite claimed entire units of engineers. Yet, as he observed through the frosted lenses of his binoculars, the Soviets defied every expectation. Each train arrived not just functioning, but on time, a miracle of coordination in a world that should have made it impossible. A particular sight froze Strasser in awe and disbelief. Near a small village, a locomotive had derailed on a frozen switch. 10 men, wrapped in fur, lunged at the engine. With crowbars, shovels, and sheer brute force, they levered the engine back onto the rails. Steam hissed, valves groaned, and the men worked tirelessly, ignoring frostbite and exhaustion. Within 40 minutes, the locomotive was running again. By German calculations, the operation should have taken hours, if not days. By reality, it was back on schedule. Strasser felt a chill deeper than the winter wind. He had just witnessed what was effectively an unbreakable supply line. The Germans could bomb and strafe, and sometimes they did. Luftwaffe pilots reported seeing trains blackened by shell holes, carriages smashed, rails bent under explosions. But the effect was temporary. Tracks were rerouted, repairs made, locomotives replaced. The Soviet rail system had contingency embedded into its very operations. Bridges were reinforced, secondary lines constructed in parallel, depots stocked with spare parts. Every failure was anticipated and mitigated. Strasser began to understand the magnitude of the challenge. Every hour the trains ran, Red Army units at the front were resupplied, medical units reinforced, and tanks refueled. The Germans could destroy a train, but it was immediately replaced, or 2 more trains appeared to compensate. Reports from Luftflotte 4 emphasized the impossibility of the situation. Strasser read them aloud to Breuer during a break in reconnaissance. They are not just operating, they are multiplying. Each train that we hit is replaced within a day. Each derailed engine is restored in hours. There is no point where we can interdict effectively. Breuer, rubbing frostbitten hands, shook his head. "We've faced skillful pilots, fortified positions, and minefields," he said, voice brittle with cold. "But this is industrial warfare on a scale we never imagined. Steel, fire, and human endurance. It's terrifying." At night, the workers' ingenuity became even more apparent. Lighting was minimal. Lanterns, fires, and oil lamps, but the trains never stopped. Signaling, essential to prevent collisions on the narrow, icebound lines, was executed through combinations of semaphore flags, lanterns, and prearranged whistles. Every engineer and conductor had memorized contingency procedures for snowdrifts, frost heaves, and broken switches. When one section froze solid, workers carried portable stoves, heated rails, and manually expanded the steel. In some cases, entire sections of track were lifted and relaid in frozen ground using improvised jacks and wedges. It was not elegance, it was survival, and it worked. The Germans could not comprehend the scale of coordination. Each division, each brigade depended on thousands of tons of supplies moved hundreds of kilometers over terrain that should have paralyzed movement entirely. By January 1943, Stalingrad itself had become the test of this logistical feat. German forces, observing from the air, saw the lifeline, the rail system connecting the northern and southern Soviet territories, delivering artillery shells, infantry reinforcements, and fuel to units entrenched in the city. Winter was no longer an advantage for the Wehrmacht. The frozen landscape, instead of hindering the Soviets, amplified their capacity to endure. In the early morning, Strasser flew a reconnaissance circuit over the Tsimlianskaya rail junction. The scene was breathtaking. Engines hissed, wheels screeched, cars rattled in perfect unison. Workers moved along the sides of the tracks, clearing snow, adjusting brakes, communicating through hand signals. Every junction was manned. Switches, points, and signals glinted with frost. It was a ballet of frozen steel, each motion rehearsed through countless hours of repetition and hardship. The German mind, trained to predict the collapse of enemy logistics under such conditions, could not compute what it saw. Strasser thought of the men in the Red Army waiting for supplies. Each train represented survival, each wagon a weapon in its own right. Mortar shells, rifles, ammunition, food, medical supplies, all moving reliably across a frozen wasteland. He realized that the Soviet capacity for endurance and adaptation had turned logistics into a force multiplier, a silent weapon that no Luftwaffe sortie could fully neutralize. To destroy the trains, the Germans would need to destroy the men themselves, and those men were seemingly endless. Reports trickled in from reconnaissance. A train carrying replacement T-34 tanks, delayed by frost, arrived on time due to ingenious heating methods in the rails and rapid repair crews. Another, filled with artillery ammunition, traversed a section of icebound river bridge that German intelligence had declared impassable. Steam engines groaned, wheels hissed, and still the trains advanced, each mile a testimony to industrial planning and human endurance intertwined. By mid-January, Strasser's squadron faced a daunting moral reality. Interdiction missions had been planned with the assumption of Soviet logistical collapse. Those assumptions were invalid. The Red Army had not only survived the onset of winter, they had adapted, strengthened, and turned extreme conditions into an advantage. Reports described frozen rivers crossed with temporary trestles, night operations on unlit tracks, crews working through frostbite and exhaustion. Each train arriving at Stalingrad or Voronezh represented not just material, but hope, a tangible sign that the Soviets were as prepared for winter as they were for battle. For the Luftwaffe, this presented a new and terrifying operational variable. The enemy's supply lines could not be destroyed by conventional means. German pilots, accustomed to rapid disruption of logistics in France, Poland, and even Russia's early campaigns, now faced an enemy whose industrial and human ingenuity allowed for constant replenishment. The result was unrelenting pressure on German ground forces, which began to falter not just from combat losses, but from exhaustion, supply shortages, and the psychological weight of knowing that every attack they launched would be met with rapid replacement of material. Strasser returned to his observation post one evening, watching the smoke columns of a dozen trains advance in parallel across the frozen plains. Each column seemed to defy nature itself. He could see workers clustered around engines, shaping frozen coal, shoveling snow, hammering at rails with fists reddened by frost. He thought of the Germans he had flown against in previous campaigns. Skilled, disciplined, aggressive. Yet even they would have been humbled by this. This was endurance beyond combat training, skill beyond aerial tactics. It was logistical warfare as an art form. The Germans could destroy tracks, derail engines, and bomb depots. Still, the Soviets replaced, repaired, and improvised faster than attacks could succeed. The winter, intended as a weapon against invaders, became a force multiplier for the Red Army. Strasser wrote in his report, "The logistical system observed exceeds expectation. Frozen conditions do not impede movement. Maintenance crews perform extraordinary feats to restore and maintain operations. Enemy supply lines operational at all times. Conventional interdiction methods inadequate. Recommend reassessment of operational doctrine for winter campaigns against Soviet forces." By the end of January 1943, German pilots were no longer laughing at frost-covered trains. They were awed, frustrated, and increasingly fearful. The trains kept moving, the rails kept clearing, and every sortie that destroyed wagons was followed by replacements that arrived on time. The Soviet logistical miracle, iron, coal, snow, and human will, was now an undeniable force on the Eastern Front. Strasser, once a veteran of campaigns across Europe, now understood that in winter the battlefield extended far beyond the front lines. Every mile of track, every worker, every locomotive was part of a living weapon system that German doctrine had failed to anticipate. February 5th, 1943. Beyond the smoke and steel of the rail yards, the human element of the Soviet logistical miracle became impossible to ignore. For German pilots, the sight from above was awe-inspiring but also incomprehensible. To see men in furs and padded coats crawling along frozen rails, dragging tools, hauling coal, and clearing snowdrifts taller than themselves, was to witness a devotion that no doctrine, no planning manual, and no Luftwaffe attack could fully disrupt. At Kotelnikovo, near the Don Bend, an entire depot lay buried under 6 feet of snow. From above, Oberleutnant Reinhardt noted the faint outlines of locomotives, black and gleaming against the white expanse. Ground crews worked in synchronized patterns, almost like machines themselves. One group shoveled paths for men hauling heavy replacement wheels, another cleared switches and points, while yet another stoked the boilers with frozen coal. Reinhardt's wingman, observing through binoculars, muttered, "How is this possible? They have no warmth, no rest, and yet they move mountains." The Soviet workforce was vast and specialized. Engineers trained in the maintenance of steam locomotives, often in pre-war industrial centers, had been evacuated east, carrying with them technical knowledge and spare parts for every conceivable breakdown. Miners who could break frozen ground with pickaxes were repurposed to clear snowdrifts along tracks. Civilians with rudimentary knowledge of rail operation were trained on the spot, working alongside seasoned veterans. This multi-tiered system ensured continuity even when losses were catastrophic. For the Germans, observing from above, the scale and precision of this human machinery seemed uncanny. One of the most astonishing feats occurred on February 12, 1943. A train carrying 50 tons of ammunition derailed when frost heave twisted the rails beneath a curve. Within minutes, workers had assembled temporary wooden jacks, pried the locomotive free, and relaid the twisted rails. Another group used portable forges to heat frozen rails and manually adjust their alignment. By dusk, the train was moving again with only a minor delay. German intelligence had assumed that winter derailments would cripple Soviet supplies for days. The reality was that such incidents were routine and anticipated. The scale of the Soviet operation extended far beyond isolated incidents. Every depot, every junction, every bridge had multiple backup crews. Trains were scheduled with redundancy, often leaving a supply train behind to cover the loss of another. Locomotives were rotated through maintenance depots every 24 hours, repaired, and returned to service faster than the Germans could track. It was a level of operational planning that made even the most experienced Wehrmacht officers uneasy. The Germans noted the improvisation in the face of extreme conditions. On February 18th, a bridge over the Donets had been damaged by bombing. Soviet engineers immediately constructed a temporary trestle using local timber and spare rails. Within 6 hours, trains carrying fuel and rations were passing over it. The Germans could destroy infrastructure, but the Soviets rebuilt it faster than the Luftwaffe could respond. Every raid that destroyed rolling stock or tracks was met with immediate replacement. By March, it had become a pattern. Every strike was a temporary inconvenience, not a strategic victory. The human factor was as critical as the machinery. Men rotated in shifts, sleeping only a few hours on frozen ground or in hastily constructed shelters. Meals were meager, often frozen or boiled quickly over open fires, but morale remained high. Orders were simple and unyielding. Keep the trains moving, no matter the cost. Discipline was strict but pragmatic. Workers were trained to anticipate failures before they occurred, and the consequences of inaction were immediate. In an environment where frostbite could kill, every second mattered. German reconnaissance pilots often noted the quiet efficiency of the Soviet system. From above, one could see a train halted in a snowdrift. Workers were already unloading cars. clearing the snow and preparing to reassemble the tracks. It was as if the frozen plains themselves had been tamed by the sheer will of the workforce. Oberleutnant Strasser reported that these operations were conducted in near silence, a rhythm of human effort that contrasted with the chaos of battle. German bombs could not silence it, nor could frost. Every success of the Soviets was a lesson in industrial endurance. Tracks were preheated in sections using steam and portable boilers. Rails were constantly inspected, tapped with hammers to detect cracks from frost, and replaced as needed. Switches were cleared, lubricated with kerosene, and shielded from snowdrifts. Rolling stock was maintained with mechanical precision. Even when locomotives were damaged by shell fire, workshops had the capacity to replace boilers, wheels, and axles with remarkable speed. German pilots began to understand that this logistical network was not merely a support function, it was a weapon. Every successful delivery of food, ammunition, and fuel sustained frontline units. It enabled counterattacks, prolonged resistance, and facilitated the Soviet ability to absorb losses that would have crippled the Wehrmacht elsewhere. The trains carried more than material. They carried the lifeblood of an army in winter, ensuring that men could fight, repair, and continue the war effort despite conditions that would have frozen other armies in place. Reports from the field confirmed the psychological impact. German infantry units, observing these trains moving reliably through snowstorms and bombardments, began to fear the relentless supply of their adversary. Strasser noted in his journal, "We assumed that the Russians would break under the cold, that starvation and frost would immobilize them. Yet they march, they fight, and they are fed. Every train we destroy is replaced, every bridge rebuilt. We have underestimated them. Logistical endurance has become a weapon, one we cannot counter from the air alone." By late February, the cumulative effect of this logistical miracle was evident. Soviet units in Stalingrad, Voronezh, and the Donets basin had received continuous supplies, allowing them to sustain offensive and defensive operations. German pilots, trained to anticipate supply shortages and operational collapse during winter, faced the impossible reality of an enemy whose trains ran with unyielding regularity. The contrast with previous campaigns was stark. Where the Wehrmacht had disrupted French and Polish logistics with relative ease, here every sabotage effort was countered by planning, improvisation, and human endurance. Even minor technical failures were mitigated by ingenuity. Frozen brake systems were thawed with portable steam pipes. Collapsed snow tunnels under embankments were dug out by hand in shifts, often with minimal lighting. Engineers improvised sledges, rollers, and pulleys to move frozen wagons back onto rails. The Germans calculated that such operations would require days. The Soviets completed them in hours. Each successful delivery reinforced morale at the front, allowing the Red Army to operate at maximum efficiency despite conditions that should have been catastrophic. Oberleutnant Strasser observed one particular scene that crystallized the essence of Soviet logistical tenacity. A train carrying 75mm artillery rounds was partially derailed in a snowdrift. Crew members, some barely able to keep their limbs from freezing, used jacks, ropes, and sheer strength to lift and realign the cars. Steam engines hissed, wheels spun, and within 90 minutes the train was moving. German intelligence had predicted that such an incident would delay supply for days. Yet, the Soviets had turned near disaster into routine maintenance. It was industrial warfare as a form of heroism, human ingenuity amplified under conditions that would have broken most armies. The cumulative effect was undeniable. By March 1943, Soviet forces were not just surviving winter, they were thriving. Supplies arrived with astonishing regularity, allowing for offensive operations that confounded German strategic calculations. German pilots flew sorties over the frozen plains, targeting rail lines, depots, and locomotives, only to witness immediate repair and replacement. The Red Army's logistical system had become both shield and sword, a frozen network of iron and fire that guaranteed operational continuity and facilitated counteroffensives. March 3, 1943. From the air, the frozen expanse of the Soviet Union resembled a living blueprint of industrial perseverance. Rail lines stretched like veins across snow-covered plains, linking cities, depots, and front lines in an unbroken lattice of movement. To German pilots, the scale of the operation was staggering. Each train, each depot, each shadow moving along the tracks was a manifestation of a system that refused to fail. Luftwaffe reconnaissance reports often concluded in disbelief. How could a nation so ravaged, so battered, maintain such a level of efficiency under winter's deadliest grip? The Soviets had transformed the winter into a tactical ally. Harsh weather conditions that immobilized most armies became a shield for the rail network. Deep snow, which could have paralyzed locomotives and encased rail infrastructure, was anticipated and countered with extraordinary foresight. Snowplows, both steam-driven and horse-drawn, cleared main lines with unerring regularity. Switches were encased in heated wooden boxes, insulated against frost, while auxiliary tracks provided redundancy in case a primary line failed. Even minor disruptions rarely translated into operational delays of more than a few hours. In the remote outskirts of Kursk, German pilots reported seeing what could only be described as a logistical ballet. Trains halted at depots for minutes before continuing their journey. Maintenance crews worked in perfect synchronization. Boilers were stoked, brakes lubricated, wheels inspected and replaced. Civilians, often conscripted or volunteered from nearby towns, moved wagons by hand, cleared sidings, and carried critical supplies up to the front. The combination of human ingenuity and industrial discipline ensured that each locomotive, each car, was returned to operational status almost immediately. One notable example occurred on March 12th when Luftwaffe bombing raids destroyed a key bridge over the Don River. German intelligence predicted weeks of halted supply lines. Soviet engineers rebuilt it in 3 days using a combination of temporary trestles, timber, and steel reinforcements. Trains carrying tanks, artillery, and ammunition crossed the bridge within 72 hours, effectively nullifying any advantage the Luftwaffe had hoped to gain. Such rapid reconstruction became a pattern. Every sabotage, every airstrike, every mechanical failure was countered with pre-planned contingencies, making the Soviet logistical network resilient to disruption in ways German forces had never encountered. The human element remained central to this resilience. Rail workers, engineers, and conscripts endured temperatures far below freezing, often without proper winter gear. Steam locomotives required constant attention. The water tanks could freeze, the boilers could crack under uneven heating, and the engines themselves were prone to mechanical failure in extreme cold. Yet crews worked tirelessly, sometimes standing ankle-deep in snow while shoveling frozen coal or manually turning wheels to realign derailed cars. Their training, combined with improvisation born of necessity, allowed operations to continue in conditions that would have immobilized other armies. Even minor mechanical issues were mitigated with astonishing speed. Frozen brake lines were thawed with portable steam systems. Track misalignments caused by frost heave were corrected using jacks, levers, and sledges in coordinated teams. When engines failed, replacement locomotives were dispatched from depots hundreds of kilometers away, often reaching stranded trains before daylight faded. German reconnaissance pilots began to recognize a pattern. No matter how thoroughly the Luftwaffe attacked, the Soviets repaired, replaced, and returned to full operational capability faster than anyone could anticipate. The scale of the rail network itself contributed to this resilience. Parallel tracks allowed trains to bypass damaged sections, while sidings and auxiliary lines facilitated the storage of rolling stock during emergencies. Depots were stocked with spare wheels, axles, and even entire boilers. Locomotives were rotated through maintenance depots on a strict schedule, ensuring that operational readiness remained near 100%. For German pilots, observing this system in motion was almost surreal. It was as if the frozen landscape itself had been harnessed and disciplined to sustain an army. Psychologically, the impact on German forces was profound. Units on the front lines reported consistent resupply of ammunition, food, and fuel despite relentless air raids and artillery bombardments. Officers noted that counterattacks and reinforcements arrived with a frequency that should have been impossible given the conditions. Reconnaissance pilots, initially sent to verify Soviet weaknesses in winter logistics, returned with reports emphasizing frustration and disbelief. The Red Army simply did not slow down, did not falter, and could not be starved into submission. German analysts were forced to revise their assessments. The harsh Russian winter, which had been assumed to be a natural ally, no longer guaranteed strategic advantage. The Soviet logistical system turned frost, snow, and ice into a protective armor for its operations. Trains moved like clockwork despite deep snowdrifts, extreme temperatures, and relentless attacks from the air. The more the Luftwaffe attempted to destroy the network, the more they realized that their enemy's success was built on a foundation of meticulous planning, robust engineering, and unparalleled human endurance. A German pilot, Oberleutnant Franz Becker, documented one reconnaissance mission over the Kursk region. I watched a train completely derailed by bombing. Men in furs, barely able to see through the snow, dragged the locomotive back onto the tracks with ropes and jacks. The engine coughed, sputtered, and then, astonishingly, moved again. Supplies continued toward the front. We have never seen anything like it. It is as if the snow itself has become part of their army. The Soviets had anticipated every conceivable failure scenario. Switches were preheated, tracks regularly tapped for cracks, and locomotives rotated for maintenance. Each rail depot functioned as a node of redundancy. Even when one depot was compromised, another could assume responsibility, sending relief trains to keep supplies flowing. This networked approach meant that disruptions in one location rarely cascaded into broader operational failures. By late March, German pilots had come to an uneasy understanding. The logistical miracle they observed from above was not luck, nor merely human stubbornness. It was a strategic weapon. Supplies moved with the precision of a military operation, yet demanded extraordinary physical and intellectual effort. Every train, every maintenance crew, every improvised repair became a force multiplier for the Red Army. The Soviets could endure, counterattack, and reinforce with a reliability that defied expectations, rendering the Luftwaffe's winter advantage largely moot. Even the most seasoned German officers struggled to comprehend the full extent. In diaries, reports, and post-war interviews, pilots repeatedly emphasized the inconceivable scale of human effort and industrial coordination. Where they had expected frozen, immobilized armies, they saw constant movement, repairs, and resilience. The Soviet rail network was no longer merely a supply line. It was a symbol of industrial and human determination, capable of outlasting bombing campaigns, weather, and attrition. April 10th, 1943. From high above the Don and Volga regions, the scale of the Soviet logistical achievement had begun to crystallize for German pilots. What they had once dismissed as a disorganized and underprepared system revealed itself as an unbroken lattice of human determination and mechanical ingenuity. Each train coursing through snow-laden plains was more than metal and coal. It was the lifeblood of an army, the conduit through which men, munitions, and morale flowed unceasingly into the crucible of combat. For the Luftwaffe, the realization came slowly, like frost creeping across the windshield of a reconnaissance cockpit. Winter, which they had assumed would be their ally, had been tamed and transformed into a weapon by their enemy. Rail yards, once mere staging grounds, had become fortresses of efficiency. At stations like Rostov, Voronezh, and Kotelnikovo, every siding and track was under constant surveillance, inspection, and repair. German pilots reported snowplows clearing lines ahead of trains, teams shoveling drifts as high as rooftops, and engineers adjusting track alignment under conditions that would have immobilized any Western European railway. Each operation seemed choreographed, a synchronized ballet of human and machine moving as if guided by invisible hands. The winter, brutal and merciless, only magnified the triumph. Locomotives were steamed before departure, tracks preheated, switches insulated, and crew rotations timed to maximize endurance. In the face of temperatures dipping below minus 40 degrees Celsius, men worked tirelessly, their breath steaming in the frozen air as they jacked up derailed wagons, repaired broken axles, and shoveled coal into boilers that hissed against the cold. There was no pause, no faltering. For every train destroyed by bombs, a replacement arrived, often within hours, loaded with ammunition, food, and fuel. The Germans began to perceive a pattern. Every strike, every air raid, every attempted sabotage was countered with almost mechanical speed. Depots stocked spare parts for every conceivable failure, engineers trained in emergency improvisation, and auxiliary lines provided immediate rerouting options. Redundancy was built into every operation. The trains were no longer merely supply, they were a weapon of psychological as well as physical sustenance. German infantry units on the ground could see the constant flow, and the realization that the enemy would never be starved or immobilized began to weigh on morale. Even the Luftwaffe's most audacious attempts could not break the rhythm. In February, a bombing raid destroyed a key bridge over the Donets. German intelligence assumed weeks of halted movement. By March, the bridge had been rebuilt, reinforced with timber and steel, and trains resumed passage. Across the theater, similar stories unfolded. Derailed trains were lifted, broken wheels replaced, frozen switches thawed, and locomotives rotated through maintenance depots at a speed that defied expectation. Each victory the Germans assumed they had achieved was fleeting. The Soviets' logistical system was a hydra, and every head cutoff was replaced before it could be counted. The human element was inseparable from the machinery. Men who had endured the siege of Leningrad, the retreat from Ukraine, or the evacuation of Moscow were redeployed to rail operations. Their knowledge, endurance, and improvisational skill transformed the impossible into routine. Workers shifted in coordinated rotations, often sleeping hours at a time in makeshift shelters, eating meager meals of bread and boiled potatoes, yet maintaining output levels that astounded observers. Even in the face of frostbite, exhaustion, and bombing, they pressed on. German pilots, watching from above, could not fathom the scale of effort required to keep the trains moving, let alone the motivation of the men doing the work. The strategic implications were profound. With railways functioning at near continuous capacity, Soviet frontline units were supplied without interruption. Artillery shells arrived for counterattacks, fuel for tanks and trucks kept mechanized units mobile, and food ensured that soldiers remained combat effective despite the bitter cold. The Germans had assumed that winter attrition would immobilize the Red Army. Instead, winter became a shield amplified by industrial foresight and human determination. By April 1943, German reports began to acknowledge an uncomfortable truth. The logistical miracle they had observed was both deliberate and sustainable. It was not a matter of luck, not a temporary aberration, but the product of planning, industrial capacity, and an extraordinary work ethic. The Soviets had turned adversity into advantage, transforming rail lines into arteries that sustained the lifeblood of an army in conditions that should have been catastrophic. Oberleutnant Reinhardt, flying reconnaissance over the Don, captured it succinctly in his journal. We believed the snow would immobilize them. We believed frost and hunger would cripple their operations. Yet they move, always move. Trains, engines, men, everything flows. It is a network without end, a machine of iron and will. We cannot stop it. We can only watch. The Germans, for all their technological skill and air superiority, could not match the combined force of Soviet industrial planning, human endurance, and sheer determination. The Red Army, fed and supplied relentlessly through the harshest winter, emerged not merely intact, but capable of decisive action. The railways, frozen yet unbroken, became a symbol of this endurance, a network of iron arteries that defied destruction and guaranteed the continuity of war. By the time the thaw came, German pilots had seen the results of this logistical marvel in action. Counteroffensives that should have stalled due to lack of ammunition or fuel continued unabated. Units that had been expected to surrender due to starvation and exposure remained combat effective. The network of railways and the men who operated them had rewritten the rules of winter warfare. The lessons were clear. In this theater, supply and endurance were as lethal as any tank or fighter. For German pilots, disbelief turned into grudging respect and eventually into an uneasy fear. Every train that continued along its route, every bridge that was rebuilt, every locomotive that steamed through the snow was a reminder that the Red Army's ability to endure and fight was limitless within the bounds of its logistical ingenuity. Where they had expected frost and chaos, they found order and tenacity. Where they had assumed weakness, they found a weapon more effective than any bomb or cannon, a living, breathing network of men and machines that could not be stopped. By the end of the winter campaign, historians would look back and recognize the scale of the achievement. Tens of thousands of rail workers, engineers, and conscripts had moved millions of tons of supplies over thousands of kilometers of frozen track, keeping an army supplied under conditions that should have been insurmountable. German pilots, from their vantage point in the skies, bore witness to a miracle of industrial and human endurance, one that ensured the survival and eventual triumph of the Red Army. In the bitter cold, amid snowdrifts, taller than tanks and rail yards buried under ice, the Soviet logistical machine kept moving. Trains ran, supplies arrived, and the Red Army remained unconquered. The Germans could not believe it, yet there it was, an iron reality beneath the winter sky, an unstoppable flow of men, material, and determination that would prove decisive in the Eastern Front. The logistical miracle of Soviet rail workers became a silent weapon of war, one whose impact would echo far beyond the frozen plains, shaping the outcome of battles, campaigns, and ultimately, history itself. The winter of 1942-43 was not only a season of frost and death, it was the proving ground for one of the most remarkable achievements of human organization in military history. The Red Army survived and ultimately triumphed because of the iron arteries maintained by workers who refused to yield to cold chaos or destruction. German pilots, once skeptical and derisive, came to understand the full scale of the miracle they had observed from above. The trains kept running, and through them, the Soviet Union kept fighting.